Hello everyone and welcome to the 7-minute explainer on this Mindworks channel. And today we are talking about, now this is a special module that I have brought for you for your knowledge upgradation and knowing the world around you. It is called This Day in History. And this day in history, today we are going to be talking about the Tiananmen Square in China and what really happened in the protests of 1989, which led to the very famous Tiananmen Massacre, as they call it. So let's see. And here, now this Tiananmen Square, as you know, was called the Gate of Heavenly Peace. But in reality, what happened was that it overlooked a scene that was anything but heavenly peace. Rather, it was like a gate to hell on the 3rd and 4th of June 1989. Earlier that year, what happened was that the square had been the site of very peaceful democratic protests. But on the June 3rd and 4th, it became a scene of chaos and devastation as the Chinese military opened fire and mowed down number of civilians. Now, since the last 30 years in the historic process, China has rarely acknowledged this massacre and never apologized for the same also. So, what exactly led to the events that led to the death of thousands of people in the Tiananmen Square on June 4th? In the late 80s, China was going through a huge change. Now, what was the change? The ruling Communist Party began to allow some private enterprises to invest in China. And the leader that time, Deng Xiaoping, he hoped to boost the economy and raise the living standards of the people. But then that move brought together with it a lot of corruption and dissatisfaction amongst the people. While at the same time, it also hoped chances of political success and development in the country. Now, the Communist Party, as usual, was divided between the two pointers here, and they tried to want the hardliners. The hardliners wanted that they wanted to maintain a strict control, while the liberal people in the Chinese party, they wanted to open up the economy. So then, in the mid-80s, what happened was that the hardliners, they actually won the battle, and therefore the protesters in the 80s started taking part, and they were those people, the students, that community actually that contributed to the number of protesters, and they were the ones who were talking about it. And who were these people? These students, these people who had lived abroad, they had studied abroad, they had been open to ideas of democracy in other countries, and therefore wanted definitely to bring it to their country. But then, what was the real scene? So here, how did the protest grow? In the spring of 1989, the protest grew with the demands for greater political freedom, and the protests was actually increased and spurred by the death of one of their favorite politicians, who was called as Hu Yaobang, and who had overseen some of the economic and political changes in the country for the better, for liberalization. But then he had been pushed out of the top position by his opponents, and he had died that year. So tens of thousands of people gathered on the day of Hu's funeral in April 1989, and they called for freedom of speech in the country and less censorship by the government. But then in the following weeks, the protesters started gathering in Beijing, and especially in the Tiananmen Square, with the numbers which are estimated to be more than 1 million actually, and that was the largest. And this Tiananmen Square was actually a very important landmark of Beijing. So, what was the government's response? Now, at first the government did not really take any direct notice or control, or they just were waiting and watching that what was happening. Party officials started disagreeing on how to respond. Now, the hardliners obviously did not want to give up control, and they wanted to stop the protests. whereas the moderates wanted to allow a little bit of concessions. But the hardliners, they won the fight, and the last 2 weeks of May, martial law was declared in Beijing, and the people were asked to go back, but they did not. Now on June 3rd and 4th, the troops began entering Beijing into the Tiananmen Square, and they opened fire on the public just like that. On their own public, the army opened fire, and they arrested and crushed a lot of protesters who were trying to, and they tried to regain the control of the area. Now, let us see how many people died. In reality, nobody till date knows how many people died. Why? Because the Chinese government said only 200 civilians died and a few were hurt. But in reality, people said that many thousands of people were actually dead after the open firing by the military. In 2017, which is very near to, today, just 4 years ago, what happened, the British ambassador to China, Sir Alan Donald, finally said that around 10,000 people had died. He was there in China at that time. And the posts leading to the massacres were all removed from the government, from all public platforms, internet, etc. So, a younger generation, a teenager who did not live in the protest at that time, actually does not know what really happened in China, in that Tiananmen Square, and how democracy had just lived like a little flare of hope that day. So, what was actually the significance of this protest? The pro-democracy protest in the Tiananmen Square basically presented a brief window of hope that China might be able to embrace a more democratic system. But alas, there was this did not happen. There was this euphoria that after decades of tyranny, the Chinese people at least had found the courage to ask to take full control of their lives and attempt to change the fate of their nation. And this massacre actually affected the life of everybody who was there witnessing or as part of the protest. And in the words of famous Chinese novelist Ma Jian, who says that every person in that crowd was later a victim of the massacre, as he says. Whether they lost their lives on June 4th or they survived their ideals, it shattered their soul, and their souls were scarred by fear for life. So that is what really happened. And now, even after 31 years, Hong Kong had been creating a vigil to commemorate all those people who had died in the Tiananmen Square. But the government, since last year, the Chinese government has put a ban on that vigil also. So you can imagine how democracy just showed a flicker of hope that day on Tiananmen Square, and it died by a brutal massacre. So this was one of the few pointers in the knowledge module that we have wanted to bring for you, and this is the first one from my side. If you like the session, please like, comment and ask me for more. You can talk about, you can even tell me what you want to know about stuff, and I'll try to find out and tell you more about it. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.